brain has a way of making old memories feel alive again. Maybe that's why Daniel Harper froze the moment his phone lit up at 11:43 that night. The house was silent except for the sound of water hitting the windows and the low hum of a television he wasn't really watching. His wife had already gone upstairs. The neighborhood outside looked empty, the kind of quiet suburban street where nothing ever seems to happen. But Daniel knew better than anyone that terrible things can hide inside ordinary places. The notification appeared from an unknown number with no message attached, only a video file. At first, he almost ignored it. Men his age receive scam texts all the time. Strange links, fake warnings, random threats. But something about this felt different. The moment he pressed play, the color drained from his face. Because the man on the screen was him, 17 years younger, standing beneath a flickering parking lot light outside Westfield High School, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his expression nervous, frozen, and somewhere off camera, a young woman's voice shaking with fear as she begged for help. The video ended before her face appeared, before the audience could fully understand what they had just witnessed. Before Daniel himself could escape the memory rushing back into his chest like floodwater breaking through a dam. Then another message appeared across the screen. 6 words that would destroy the life he spent years trying to build. You've spent your whole life pretending you're innocent. Daniel stared at the phone so long the screen eventually dimmed black. He could hear his own breathing growing louder, slower, uneven. For 17 years, he had convinced himself that night belonged in the past, that people move on, that mistakes fade, that silence eventually stops echoing inside your head if you bury it deeply enough. But some memories wait patiently, and some truths do not stay buried forever. What Daniel didn't know yet was that this single message would trigger a chain of events exposing secrets that nobody in his town wanted reopened. Not the police. Not the school, not the people who claimed they cared. Because long before Daniel became the target of anonymous videos and public hatred, there was a girl named Claire Monroe whose disappearance left scars that never truly healed. Everyone believes they are a good person. That is what makes stories like this so difficult to sit through. Most people do not wake up planning to ruin somebody's life. Most people never commit violent crimes. They pay their bills. They raise families. They hold doors open for strangers. They tell themselves they would do the right thing if they were ever truly tested. But history is filled with ordinary people who watched suffering happen from a safe distance and convinced themselves it was not their responsibility to step in. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this story. Daniel Harper was not a criminal. He was a respected guidance counselor in a quiet American town outside Cleveland, Ohio. Neighbors trusted him with their children. Parents described him as calm and dependable. Students said he listened when others didn't. Yet somewhere buried inside his past was a moment he spent 17 years trying to forget. And now somebody wanted the world to see it. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By sunrise the next morning, Daniel had already watched the video another 12 times. Not because he wanted to, but because fear has a strange way of forcing people to relive the moments they regret most. He sat alone in the kitchen while cold coffee collected untouched beside him. Every replay revealed details he wished he could erase. The rain-soaked pavement, the trembling voice, the hesitation in his own posture. What terrified him most was not what the footage showed, but what it implied. Whoever recorded that night had been there, watching, waiting. And after all these years, they had finally decided to come forward. Daniel searched the number. No results. He checked the metadata on the file. Nothing useful. It had been scrubbed clean. Then another notification arrived. This time it was a photograph. An old yearbook page from Westfield High. One face circled in red marker. Claire Monroe. Underneath the image were 3 words. Do you remember? Daniel closed the phone immediately, but it was too late. The memories were already returning whether he wanted them to or not. 17 years earlier, Claire Monroe had been the kind of teenager adults often misunderstood. Quiet students usually are. She was intelligent, artistic, withdrawn, and constantly exhausted. Teachers described her as distracted. Other students described her as strange. But people who actually knew Claire remembered something else. They remembered a girl who noticed everything. A girl who wrote poetry in the margins of her notebooks and stayed late after class because going home filled her with anxiety she could never fully explain. At first, nobody thought much about the bruises. High school students get injured all the time. Sports accidents, clumsy falls. Bad explanations become easier to accept when the truth feels uncomfortable. Daniel noticed the bruises too. He even asked Claire once if everything was okay at home. She smiled nervously and said yes. He accepted the answer because accepting it was easier than asking harder questions. Years later, that conversation would replay in his head more than any other. Because deep down, Daniel knew she had wanted him to push further. He just didn't. The town of Westfield looked like the kind of place where families moved to feel safe. Tree-lined streets, football games on Friday nights, community cookouts during summer. But beneath the polished surface, people carried secrets the same way every town does. Claire lived with her mother and her mother's boyfriend, a man named Richard Bennett. Neighbors described Richard as charming when he wanted to be. Friendly, helpful, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered birthdays. But there were whispers too. Arguments heard through thin apartment walls. Police visits that never led anywhere. Claire once told a friend she hated going home after dark. Another student later claimed Claire admitted someone had been following her. Nobody took it seriously enough. Teenagers say alarming things all the time, and adults have a dangerous habit of dismissing fear when it arrives wrapped in uncertainty. Daniel would later tell investigators he never saw direct evidence of abuse. Legally, maybe that mattered. Morally, the answer felt less clear every year that passed. What makes this story so difficult is that nobody involved believed they were doing something unforgivable at the time. Daniel did not see himself as weak. The teachers did not see themselves as negligent. Even the police officers who responded to complaints at Claire's apartment believed they were following procedure. But terrible outcomes are often built from small moments of hesitation. One ignored phone call, one assumption, one decision to mind your own business. Claire started reaching out more during the months leading to her disappearance. Emails sent late at night, requests to speak privately after school, questions that sounded harmless on the surface but carried desperation underneath. One message read, "Do you think people can know something bad is happening and still pretend they don't?" Daniel never answered that email. At the time, he told himself he was busy. There would always be another opportunity to talk tomorrow. But tomorrow is a dangerous promise because sometimes people disappear before it arrives. Weeks before Claire vanished, another student overheard a heated argument near the school parking lot. Witnesses later claimed Claire was crying while Richard Bennett shouted at her beside his truck. Several people saw it happen. Daniel saw it too. That was the moment captured in the anonymous video, sitting on his kitchen table 17 years later. The footage showed Daniel standing only feet away while Claire pleaded with someone to help her. Yet instead of intervening, he hesitated. He watched. Then eventually he walked away. Nobody knew why except Daniel himself. Maybe fear. Maybe uncertainty. Maybe the deeply human instinct to avoid conflict when the consequences feel unpredictable. But for Claire, that moment became impossible to forget. And for the person secretly filming nearby, it became evidence. Evidence that silence can wound people just as deeply as cruelty sometimes can. The night Claire disappeared began with heavy rain and 11 unanswered phone calls. Daniel remembered every single one because he counted them afterward. At first, he ignored the ringing because it was late and he had already convinced himself he was becoming too emotionally involved in a student's personal problems. The calls kept coming anyway. Then they stopped. Just after midnight, Claire left one final voicemail. Daniel never listened to it at the time. By morning, Claire Monroe was gone. Her backpack was discovered near a wooded area outside town 3 days later. Search teams covered miles of forest. News stations camped outside the school. Parents panicked. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed she had run away. Others suspected something worse. Richard Bennett claimed he had no idea where she went. Police questioned him repeatedly, but lacked enough evidence to charge him with anything. And through all of it, Daniel remained silent about what he witnessed in that parking lot. He told himself it probably had nothing to do with her disappearance. That assumption would haunt him for the rest of his life. By the end of that week, Daniel Harper's life no longer belonged to him. The second video appeared online late Thursday evening, uploaded anonymously to multiple social media accounts before spreading across discussion forums faster than anyone could contain it. Unlike the first clip sent privately to Daniel's phone, this one was meant for the public. Millions of people who had never heard of Westfield, Ohio suddenly found themselves staring at grainy footage of a younger Daniel standing motionless outside Westfield High School while a frightened teenage girl cried somewhere beyond the camera frame. The internet immediately did what it always does. People began investigating. Strangers searched public records, school archives, old newspaper articles, and forgotten local stories until Daniel's entire identity was exposed within hours. His address leaked online before sunrise. By morning, reporters were parked outside his neighborhood waiting for him to step outside. Nobody fully understood what they were looking at yet, but that uncertainty only made the story spread faster. Because people are drawn to mysteries involving ordinary individuals hiding uncomfortable secrets. Daniel was not famous. He was not wealthy. He was not powerful. He was exactly the kind of person viewers could imagine living 3 houses down from them. And that made the situation far more unsettling. For years, Daniel Harper had lived the kind of quiet suburban life most Americans spend decades trying to build. At 52 years old, he had become a respected figure in the community. Former students remembered him as patient and calm. Parents trusted him. Neighbors waved at him while walking their dogs in the evening. He and his wife Rebecca had been married for 27 years. Their home sat on a peaceful street lined with trimmed hedges and basketball hoops where children rode bicycles after school. Daniel spent weekends fixing things around the house, attending church occasionally, and helping organize local charity events. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about him. That normalcy became one of the most disturbing parts of the story because the videos emerging online were not exposing a violent criminal hiding in plain sight. They were exposing moments of hesitation, moments where Daniel witnessed suffering, fear, or warning signs and chose to remain passive. None of the clips showed him physically harming anyone. None proved he committed a crime. Yet each video left viewers with the same uncomfortable feeling growing heavier in their stomachs. If Daniel was innocent, why did he look so afraid? The third upload appeared 2 days later and changed everything. It began with blurry footage from inside a school hallway dated February 14, 2009. Students moved casually through the corridor while lockers slammed in the background. Then the camera focused on Claire Monroe standing near the guidance office, visibly upset. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying. Seconds later, Daniel stepped into frame holding a stack of papers against his chest. Claire reached toward him desperately, saying something too quiet for viewers to hear clearly. Daniel glanced nervously around the hallway before shaking his head and walking away. The footage paused there. Then white text appeared against a black screen. Sometimes people beg for help without saying the words. The internet exploded. Comment sections filled with arguments almost instantly. Some viewers defended Daniel, insisting the clips lacked context. Others accused him of helping cover up abuse. Several true crime creators began producing breakdown videos, analyzing his facial expressions frame by frame. Former students from Westfield High started sharing memories online. Some described Claire as troubled and unstable. Others claimed she had repeatedly tried telling adults something terrible was happening at home. Every new theory pulled Daniel deeper into public suspicion, even though no formal charges existed against him. What frightened Daniel most was how carefully the anonymous sender selected each clip. Whoever was behind the uploads understood exactly how to create doubt without revealing too much too soon. The videos never showed enough to provide complete answers, only fragments designed to force viewers into asking questions that grew darker each day. Who was filming these moments 17 years ago? Why wait until now to release them? And why did Daniel react with visible panic before anyone even accused him of wrongdoing? Rebecca noticed the fear immediately. On the third night after the videos surfaced, she found Daniel sitting alone in the garage, staring at old photo albums spread across the floor. He was removing pictures one by one and feeding them into a cardboard box beside him. Family vacations, school events, graduation ceremonies. Rebecca asked what he was doing, but Daniel barely answered. "I should have thrown these away years ago," he muttered quietly. That sentence unsettled her more than the videos themselves because it sounded less like confusion and more like guilt. The kind of guilt people carry long before the world notices it. Online discussions became increasingly vicious as amateur investigators dissected every detail of Daniel's past. Reddit forums dedicated entire threads to the Westfield mystery. TikTok creators stitched emotional reactions beside clips of Claire Monroe's yearbook photo, while dramatic music played underneath. Local news stations reopened the disappearance case during primetime broadcasts. One former classmate claimed Claire used to tell people she was afraid of someone at home. Another remembered seeing bruises she tried covering with oversized sweaters. Soon, residents who had not thought about Claire in nearly 2 decades found cameras pushed into their faces asking whether Westfield High ignored warning signs. Daniel watched all of it unfold from inside his living room while reporters camped outside his house around the clock. He stopped answering calls. He stopped sleeping properly. Every creak outside the house made him look toward the windows. Every passing car felt threatening. The terrifying part was not that strangers thought he was capable of something awful. The terrifying part was that deep down, Daniel had already spent 17 years wondering the same thing about himself. Then came the clip that changed public opinion permanently. Unlike the earlier uploads, this one lasted only 11 seconds. A dark screen flickered before suddenly revealing a teenage girl screaming through tears. The footage shook violently, as if the person filming was running. Claire Monroe's voice cracked with panic while she shouted words that would soon appear across headlines nationwide. "You could have stopped him." The video cut instantly before revealing who she was speaking to. No explanation followed. No context. Just silence. Yet for millions of viewers, those 4 words felt like confirmation of something terrible. Within hours, Daniel's name trended across social media alongside accusations ranging from negligence to direct involvement in Claire's disappearance. Protesters appeared outside his house, carrying signs demanding accountability. Neighbors who once smiled politely now whispered while watching him through curtains. Rebecca started staying with her sister because reporters followed her everywhere she went. Daniel's entire life began collapsing under the weight of a question nobody could answer yet. If he truly did nothing wrong, why did Claire sound so betrayed? Long before strangers online started calling Daniel Harper a coward, the people who knew him described someone completely different. That contradiction is part of what made the story spread so quickly across the country. Nobody expects darkness to attach itself to men who seem ordinary. The neighbors living on Ashford Lane remembered Daniel as the man who shoveled snow from elderly driveways before sunrise during harsh Ohio winters. Every Sunday morning, he carried groceries into Mrs. Patterson's house 2 doors down because arthritis made it painful for her to lift heavy bags. When a local family lost their home during a kitchen fire, Daniel helped organize donation drives and spent entire weekends repairing damaged walls alongside volunteers half his age. None of these things were performed for praise or recognition. In fact, Daniel avoided attention whenever possible. That was one reason people trusted him. He seemed sincere in a way that felt increasingly rare. Parents described him as patient. Former coworkers called him dependable. Friends used words like steady and kind. Even after the videos surfaced online, several people defended him publicly because the version of Daniel being discussed on television felt impossible to reconcile with the man they thought they knew. Old family photographs painted the same picture. Daniel smiling beside Rebecca during summer barbecues, coaching Little League Baseball while children chased foul balls across dusty fields, sitting at Thanksgiving dinners surrounded by relatives laughing over stories repeated every year. There was one photograph investigators later focused on repeatedly after the case exploded online. It showed Daniel standing beside a group of teenagers at Westfield High School during a charity fundraiser in 2009. Claire Monroe stood only a few feet away in the image holding a paintbrush in one hand while staring directly at the camera with a faint, uneasy smile. At the time, nobody looking at that photograph would have imagined it represented the beginning of a tragedy still unresolved nearly 2 decades later. Yet something unsettling happens when people revisit old images after discovering painful truths. Expressions suddenly seem suspicious. Smiles appear forced. Tiny details feel loaded with hidden meaning. The internet became obsessed with dissecting every surviving photo involving Claire and Daniel, searching desperately for clues that might explain how a respected school counselor became connected to one of the most haunting disappearances in Westfield's history. Back in 2009, Daniel Harper worked as a guidance counselor at Westfield High School, a job he genuinely cared about. Unlike some staff members who treated troubled students as disciplinary problems waiting to happen, Daniel usually listened carefully. He understood that teenagers often carried burdens adults overlooked too easily. Claire Monroe entered his office for the first time during her junior year after failing several assignments unexpectedly. On paper, she appeared gifted. Her teachers described her as intelligent and creative when she applied herself. She loved sketching portraits in the corners of her notebooks and spent hours painting abstract scenes filled with lonely roads, empty houses, and faceless figures standing in heavy rain. But something had changed during the months before she met Daniel. Her attendance became inconsistent. She stopped socializing with friends. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes from lack of sleep. Several teachers assumed she was struggling emotionally after her parents' divorce, but students close to Claire sensed something deeper was wrong. Fear lingered around her constantly, even during ordinary conversations. Daniel noticed that fear almost immediately. At first, Claire barely spoke during their meetings. She answered questions quietly while avoiding eye contact and twisting the sleeves of her sweater around her hands. But over time, she slowly became more comfortable around him. Daniel reminded her of the kind adults she wished existed more often in the world. Calm, non-judgmental, safe. She started visiting his office several afternoons each week under the excuse of discussing college applications or class schedules, though their conversations rarely stayed focused on school for long. Claire spoke about feeling trapped at home, about constant arguments between her mother and Richard Bennett, about how exhausting it felt pretending everything was normal around other people. She never directly accused Richard of hurting her, at least not in words clear enough to trigger mandatory reporting laws, but she dropped hints heavy enough that Daniel should have understood what they meant. Years later, he would admit that part of him probably did understand. He simply lacked the courage to confront what acting on those suspicions might require. One afternoon during winter semester, another student named Megan Lawson stopped outside Daniel's office after class and casually mentioned something disturbing. She told him Claire kept insisting somebody had been following her home after school. Megan laughed nervously while describing it because she assumed Claire might be exaggerating due to stress or anxiety. Daniel initially reacted the same way. Teenagers often make dramatic statements while processing emotional difficulties, and school staff become conditioned to separating genuine danger from ordinary adolescent fears. But later that evening, Daniel remembered the concern in Megan's voice and started wondering whether he should have asked more questions. That uncertainty only deepened a week later when Claire arrived at school wearing long sleeves despite unusually warm weather. During a meeting in his office, the cuff of her sweater slipped slightly while reaching for a tissue, revealing dark bruising around her wrist. Daniel noticed immediately. Claire pulled the sleeve back down almost instantly, pretending nothing happened. The room fell silent for several uncomfortable seconds. Daniel could have asked directly where the bruises came from. He could have documented his concerns. He could have contacted authorities. Instead, he changed the subject. For years afterward, Daniel replayed that moment endlessly in his mind. The silence, the hesitation, the feeling in his chest telling him something was wrong, while another voice insisted he might be overreacting. At the time, Daniel convinced himself it was not his place to interfere without concrete proof. He worried about making false accusations. He worried about damaging a family unfairly. He worried about the consequences of involving police if he misunderstood the situation. Those explanations sounded reasonable enough then. They even sounded responsible. But after Claire disappeared, every excuse transformed into something uglier. Because hindsight has a brutal way of exposing the difference between caution and avoidance. Daniel was not blind. He was afraid of being wrong. And sometimes fear disguises itself so convincingly as rationality that people fail to recognize it until the damage is already done. One conversation between Daniel and Claire would later haunt nearly everyone who learned about the case. It happened only weeks before her disappearance during an evening art fundraiser at the school gymnasium. Witnesses remembered Claire seeming unusually withdrawn that night. Daniel found her sitting alone near the bleachers after most students had already left. For several minutes, they talked quietly about ordinary things like graduation and college plans before Claire suddenly asked him a question that caught him off guard. Do you think people know when something bad is happening and just choose not to get involved? Daniel laughed awkwardly at first because the question sounded strangely intense for casual conversation. But Claire kept staring at him, waiting for an answer. Finally, she said something investigators would later repeat countless times during interviews and documentaries about the case. People always watch bad things happen. Nobody wants responsibility. Daniel tried reassuring her that good people usually step in when it matters. Claire looked away and whispered, "I don't think that's true anymore." At the time, Daniel assumed she was speaking generally about the world. 17 years later, he realized she may have been speaking directly about him. As winter faded into spring during Claire Monroe's junior year, the people around her began noticing changes they could no longer easily explain away. She looked exhausted almost every day. Teachers reported she struggled concentrating in class, even though she had once been among the strongest students academically. Her artwork became increasingly disturbing, filled with isolated figures standing beneath dark skies or faceless people watching silently from windows while someone cried in the distance. One teacher later admitted she considered referring Claire for psychological evaluation, but never followed through because the school already lacked resources for students facing emotional difficulties. That detail would become painfully important later. Like many tragedies, this story was not created by one catastrophic decision alone. It was built slowly through small moments where people assumed somebody else would step in eventually. Daniel Harper continued meeting privately with Claire several afternoons each week, and by then he had become one of the only adults she seemed willing to trust. But trust creates responsibility, and responsibility can feel frightening when someone else's suffering suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Claire started emailing Daniel late at night more frequently during those final months. At first, the messages sounded harmless enough. Questions about scholarships, concerns about graduation requirements, requests for advice about leaving town after high school. But hidden between those ordinary conversations were sentences carrying fear Daniel did not fully understand until years later. One email sent at 1:14 in the morning simply read, "Do you ever get the feeling something bad is about to happen and nobody believes you?" Another message arrived 3 nights later after midnight. If somebody wanted help but didn't know how to explain what was wrong, what would they even say? Daniel sometimes answered the emails briefly during work hours the next day. Other times he ignored them entirely because they arrived late and felt emotionally exhausting after long days at school. He did not ignore them out of cruelty. That is what makes the story so unsettling. Daniel cared about Claire in the way decent teachers care about struggling students. But caring from a comfortable distance is very different from taking action once another person's pain starts demanding something from you personally. The more Claire reached outward for support, the more unstable her behavior appeared to others around her. Friends later described her as paranoid during the weeks before she vanished. She constantly checked over her shoulder while walking through parking lots. She jumped whenever unfamiliar cars slowed near the sidewalk after school. One classmate remembered Claire refusing to go home one evening until nearly midnight because she claimed Richard Bennett was waiting for her outside. Police records later confirmed officers had visited the Monroe residence multiple times over previous years after neighbors reported loud arguments and suspected domestic disturbances. None of those visits resulted in arrests. Richard always appeared calm when authorities arrived. Claire's mother insisted everything was fine. Without visible evidence or formal accusations, officers eventually stopped treating the home as a priority. The system moved on, but Claire never truly relaxed afterward. Even Daniel noticed her hands trembling during conversations toward the end. He saw fear growing inside her. He just underestimated how desperate the situation had become. Then came the night that changed everything. April 18, 2009. Heavy rain hammered Westfield from late evening onward, while thunder rattled windows across town. Daniel had fallen asleep in the living room with the television still glowing softly in the background when his phone began vibrating repeatedly on the coffee table beside him. Claire's name appeared on the screen. The first call woke him briefly, but he let it ring out while half asleep. Then another call came minutes later. Then another. By the fourth attempt, Daniel sat up and stared at the phone with growing anxiety. He considered answering. Something about the persistence unsettled him immediately, but exhaustion mixed with hesitation in the worst possible way. He told himself he would call her back in the morning after things calmed down. Maybe she was having another emotional episode. Maybe she simply needed someone to talk to. The calls continued anyway. 11 missed calls in total. At 12:43 a.m., Daniel finally silenced the phone completely and placed it face down on the table beside him. That single motion would define the rest of his life. Around that same time, witnesses later reported seeing a teenage girl running through the rain near Old Mill Road, less than 2 miles from Claire's home. One driver remembered spotting someone matching her description sprinting across the shoulder while looking terrified. Another claimed a dark pickup truck accelerated moments later in the same direction. Fragments of information emerged slowly over the following weeks like disconnected pieces of a nightmare nobody could fully reconstruct. A gas station security camera captured blurry footage of Claire standing alone beneath fluorescent lights shortly after midnight, appearing frightened and disoriented. Nearby residents reported hearing screaming carried through the storm, but assumed it came from drunken teenagers or late-night arguments. Search teams later discovered Claire's torn backpack near a wooded drainage ditch outside town. Mud covered most of the contents inside except for a sketchbook wrapped carefully in plastic. Investigators found frantic drawings filling nearly every page. Some depicted shadowy figures watching from parked vehicles. Others showed faceless adults standing motionless while a young girl screamed for help nobody answered. By sunrise, Claire Monroe had officially disappeared. Panic spread through Westfield almost immediately because missing teenagers were rare in the community. Search volunteers gathered near the high school parking lot before noon carrying flashlights, rain gear, and printed photographs of Claire's face. Local news stations interrupted programming with emergency bulletins asking viewers for information. Parents called schools demanding reassurance their children were safe. Helicopters circled wooded areas while police officers searched abandoned properties throughout the county. Daniel joined several community searches during those first days, though witnesses later described him as strangely distant during interviews with investigators. He answered questions carefully. Too carefully, some people would later argue. At the time, nobody understood the weight he carried privately. Daniel knew Claire had tried contacting him repeatedly hours before she vanished. Yet he never mentioned the missed calls publicly. Not to police. Not to Rebecca. Not even to himself in any honest way. He buried the guilt immediately beneath excuses about uncertainty and timing, because facing the alternative felt unbearable. Then the investigation uncovered something devastating. Detectives eventually learned Claire had attempted reporting abuse involving Richard Bennett weeks before her disappearance. According to school records later obtained by investigators, Claire spoke indirectly with multiple adults about feeling unsafe at home. A teacher remembered her asking strange questions about protective custody procedures. A school nurse documented bruising but failed to escalate concerns formally. One friend claimed Claire begged her not to tell authorities because she feared retaliation if Richard discovered she spoke to anyone. Piece by piece, investigators realized several people possessed fragments of the truth without understanding how dangerous the situation had become collectively. No single person had enough information to stop what happened, but together, they might have saved her. That realization transformed the case from a simple missing persons investigation into something far more disturbing. Claire Monroe had not disappeared because nobody noticed warning signs. She disappeared because too many people noticed them separately and assumed somebody else would act first. 17 years later, sitting alone inside his garage while anonymous videos destroyed his reputation online, Daniel Harper finally opened a storage box he had not touched in over a decade. Dust covered old files, yearbooks, and forgotten school paperwork stacked carelessly inside. Beneath everything else sat an outdated flip phone sealed in a plastic evidence bag investigators returned years earlier after Claire's disappearance case went cold. Daniel stared at the phone for several seconds before powering it on with shaking hands. The battery barely held enough charge to illuminate the screen. 11 missed calls from Claire Monroe still remained saved in the call history exactly where he left them 17 years earlier. But there was something else too. One unheard voicemail. Length, 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Daniel closed his eyes tightly before pressing play. Then the screen cut to black. The voicemail began with several seconds of static and heavy breathing before Claire Monroe finally spoke. Her voice sounded weak, frightened, exhausted in a way that instantly transported Daniel Harper back 17 years into the worst night of his life. "Daniel," she whispered softly, as though terrified someone nearby might overhear her. Rain pounded loudly in the background while cars passed somewhere far away. "I don't know who else to call anymore." Daniel pressed the phone harder against his ear as his entire body stiffened. Then Claire started crying. Not dramatic crying. Not hysterical screaming. The kind of quiet crying that comes from someone trying desperately not to completely fall apart. She said she thought Richard Bennett knew she had been talking to people at school. She said she was scared to go home. Then her voice suddenly dropped lower, almost disappearing beneath the storm outside. "If something happens to me," she began saying before a loud sound interrupted her sentence completely. Tires screeching. Claire gasping sharply. The audio distorted violently for a moment before the voicemail ended mid-breath. No goodbye. No final explanation. Just abrupt silence. Daniel sat motionless in the darkness of his garage long after the message finished playing. Then, for the first time since Claire disappeared, he finally broke down completely. There is something deeply terrifying about realizing the worst moment of your life could have been prevented by a single decision measured in seconds. Daniel replayed the voicemail over and over until sunrise, each replay making the guilt inside him feel heavier. Because the truth he spent years avoiding no longer sounded uncertain. Claire had called him because she trusted him. She believed he might help when nobody else would. And he silenced the phone. The internet still debated whether Daniel deserved blame legally, but morally the answer became harder for even he himself to deny. By the following afternoon, another anonymous upload appeared online. This time the footage showed Daniel sitting inside his car outside Westfield High School only hours before Claire vanished. The timestamp confirmed something investigators never publicly disclosed years earlier. Daniel remained parked outside the school nearly 40 minutes after classes ended while Claire argued with Richard Bennett across the parking lot. The footage zoomed in slowly on Daniel gripping the steering wheel while visibly watching the confrontation unfold from a distance. Then the screen froze before cutting to black. One sentence appeared beneath the image. He saw enough. Millions of viewers watched the clip within hours. The uploads became increasingly personal after that. Whoever controlled the account understood Daniel's life intimately. Each video focused not on acts of cruelty, but moments where Daniel chose emotional safety over confrontation. One clip showed him overhearing two teachers discussing concerns about Claire's bruises before quietly walking away without contributing. Another revealed school emails proving Claire repeatedly requested private meetings with him during the final weeks before her disappearance. None of the footage proved Daniel committed a crime. That was what disturbed people so deeply. The videos forced viewers to confront a possibility many recognized uncomfortably inside themselves. Most harm in the world is not caused by monsters. It survives because ordinary people convince themselves staying uninvolved is easier than risking discomfort. That realization transformed Daniel from a simple internet villain into something far more complicated. People watching began asking themselves whether they would have behaved differently in his position, and many hated the uncertainty of their own answers. Public opinion split violently across television panels, podcasts, and online debates. Some people insisted Daniel Harper was being unfairly targeted for mistakes countless others make every day. He didn't hurt anyone, one commentator argued during a national interview. He's guilty of hesitation, not violence. Others disagreed passionately. Survivors of abuse shared personal stories online about adults who ignored warning signs while pretending not to notice what was happening. Hashtags accusing Daniel of helping enable Claire's suffering spread across social media platforms overnight. Protesters gathered outside Westfield High demanding accountability from former staff members connected to the case. The phrase "silence is violence" appeared on signs, shirts, and comment sections everywhere. One viral video comparing Daniel to bystanders who failed to intervene during emergencies gained over 12 million views within 3 days. But the reason the story became impossible to ignore was because Daniel did not fit the image people expected. He was not cruel. He was not openly malicious. He looked painfully human. That frightened people more than outright evil ever could, because it suggested moral failure often wears an ordinary face. As the case regained national attention, investigators and internet sleuths began chasing countless theories about who might be responsible for the anonymous uploads. Several former classmates of Claire Monroe quickly became subjects of suspicion after online forums uncovered old social media posts discussing the disappearance years earlier. One former student, named Tyler Brooks, admitted publicly that he carried guilt for ignoring Claire's behavior before she vanished, causing thousands of viewers to wonder whether he was secretly behind the videos. Then attention shifted toward Claire's younger brother, Ethan Monroe, who disappeared from public life shortly after her case went cold. Rumors spread claiming Ethan blamed adults at Westfield for failing his sister and spent years collecting evidence against them. Meanwhile, a popular true crime podcaster named Rachel Vance inserted herself aggressively into the story by releasing investigative episodes suggesting corruption inside local law enforcement. Her sudden access to unreleased documents made people suspect she might somehow be connected to the uploads herself. Even retired Detective Frank Mercer, who originally worked Claire's disappearance case obsessively before losing his career after accusing Richard Bennett publicly without sufficient evidence, became a possible suspect. Every lead felt plausible enough to keep audiences hooked while revealing almost nothing concrete. Daniel's life collapsed piece by piece while strangers debated his guilt from behind phone screens. The private counseling practice where he worked placed him on indefinite leave after parents threatened legal action if he remained employed. Rebecca stopped speaking to reporters entirely and spent most nights away from home because protesters regularly gathered outside their street shouting accusations through megaphones after dark. Old friends gradually distanced themselves once national media attention intensified. Some believed Daniel had failed Claire morally. Others simply feared becoming associated with him publicly. Sleep became almost impossible. Daniel spent nights pacing through dark rooms, replaying memories he no longer trusted himself to interpret accurately. That was the most dangerous part of prolonged guilt. Over time, it reshapes memory itself. Daniel started questioning whether he overlooked even more warning signs than he originally admitted. Did Claire ever directly tell him something he refused to hear? Had he convinced himself events were less obvious than they truly were? The lines separating denial from honest uncertainty blurred more every day until even Daniel could no longer tell which version of his past was real. Then came the discovery that changed the entire investigation. Late one evening, Daniel paused one of the anonymous videos frame by frame, searching desperately for details everyone else overlooked. During a brief section showing Claire near the school parking lot the night she disappeared, Daniel noticed something horrifying reflected faintly in a nearby vehicle window. Another person standing only yards away holding a camera. He froze immediately. Investigators later confirmed the angle shown in the footage could not possibly have come from school security systems or publicly released evidence files. Whoever recorded those clips had physically been there that night watching events unfold in real time. The realization transformed the entire case instantly. The anonymous uploader was not merely exposing hidden truths years later. They were a witness. Someone who stood near Claire Monroe during the final hours before she vanished and remained silent all these years too. Suddenly, the question haunting the entire country shifted dramatically. People were no longer asking whether Daniel Harper failed Claire Monroe. They were asking who else had been standing in the darkness that night watching everything happen. The clue that finally led Daniel Harper to the abandoned house appeared hidden for less than 2 seconds inside one of the anonymous uploads. Most viewers never noticed it. During a distorted frame from the school parking lot footage, a faded street sign reflected briefly in the corner of a rain-covered car window. Daniel recognized it immediately because Westfield had removed that sign nearly 15 years earlier after a warehouse district redevelopment project outside town. The location sat abandoned now, filled with collapsing buildings, broken windows, and empty industrial lots where nobody visited after dark unless they wanted to disappear from public view. Daniel drove there alone just after midnight, carrying nothing except the old flip phone containing Claire Monroe's final voicemail. Rain fell lightly as he pulled beside a decaying 2-story house hidden behind overgrown trees near the edge of the property. The structure looked half consumed by time itself. Paint peeled from the walls. Several windows were boarded shut, yet faint light flickered somewhere upstairs. Daniel stood frozen outside for several moments before finally stepping toward the front door with shaking hands. Deep down, he already sensed whatever waited inside would destroy the last excuses he still clung to. The smell of dust and mildew filled the house immediately. Daniel moved cautiously through narrow hallways littered with newspapers, broken furniture, and stacks of old recording equipment covered in gray sheets. Then he noticed the tapes. Hundreds of them. VHS cassettes stacked from floor to ceiling across nearly every room. each one carefully labeled with dates stretching back decades. Some labels included names. Others carried locations. Westfield High School, Monroe Residence, parking lot, April 18, 2009. Daniel's chest tightened painfully as he walked deeper into the house, realizing somebody had spent years documenting the lives of people connected to Claire Monroe. This was not random obsession. It was methodical, intentional, personal. At the far end of the living room sat an old projector already humming softly in the darkness as though expecting him. Before Daniel could touch anything, the machine suddenly flickered alive on its own. Grainy footage illuminated a stained wall across the room. And then Daniel saw himself. The tape showed the Westfield High parking lot on the night Claire disappeared from an angle far clearer than anything released publicly online. Rain hammered the pavement while students hurried toward their cars beneath umbrellas. Young Daniel stood beside his vehicle watching Claire Monroe argue violently with Richard Bennett near the edge of the lot. Even through the distorted footage, Claire's fear was obvious. She kept trying to pull away while Richard grabbed her arm aggressively enough to force nearby students into nervous glances before quickly looking away. Then came the moment Daniel spent 17 years trying to blur inside his own memory. Richard shoved Claire hard enough that she stumbled against another parked car. Daniel saw it happen clearly. There was no ambiguity anymore. No uncertainty. No possibility. He misunderstood the situation. Present-day Daniel stared silently at the projection while his younger self remained motionless beside his own car, watching everything unfold from a safe distance. For several agonizing seconds, it looked as though he might finally intervene. Instead, young Daniel slowly climbed into his vehicle. His headlights turned on, and then he drove away. Daniel collapsed into a chair beside the projector, unable to breathe properly. The footage continued playing while memories he spent nearly 2 decades suppressing returned with unbearable clarity. He remembered gripping the steering wheel that night, convincing himself he should not interfere in a domestic argument without understanding the full situation. He remembered rationalizing his fear because Richard Bennett had a reputation for aggression, and Daniel worried confronting him alone might escalate things further. He remembered telling himself Claire would probably go home safely once tempers cooled down. But watching the tape stripped away every comforting explanation he built over the years. The truth was simpler and far uglier. He saw a terrified teenage girl being hurt, and he left. Hours later, Claire Monroe disappeared forever. Daniel never contacted police afterward about what he witnessed, because by then panic and guilt had already consumed him. Each passing day made confessing feel more impossible. So he buried the memory instead. Built a family. Built a career. Built an ordinary life over a moment of cowardice he hoped time would eventually erase. But time never erased it for the person secretly recording from the shadows that night. As the tape ended, another figure stepped slowly from the darkness behind the projector. Daniel turned instinctively, his face already pale with exhaustion and grief. The man standing there looked older than the photographs Daniel remembered, worn down by years of anger and isolation, but recognizable enough that the realization hit immediately. Ethan Monroe, Claire's younger brother. The same quiet 14-year-old boy investigators interviewed repeatedly after Claire vanished before eventually fading from public attention altogether. Ethan looked at Daniel without emotion for several long seconds before finally speaking. "You remember now," he said quietly. Daniel tried responding, but no words came out. Because standing in front of Ethan forced him to confront something even worse than public humiliation. Claire Monroe had family. Family who spent 17 years living with unanswered questions, while Daniel spent those same years pretending silence protected him from responsibility. Ethan slowly walked toward the shelves lining the walls filled with tapes collected obsessively over time. He explained that after Claire disappeared, he became consumed by one question nobody around him seemed willing to answer honestly. How could so many adults fail someone asking for help repeatedly? At first, he blamed Richard Bennett alone. But as he grew older and gained access to police reports, school records, and witness statements, Ethan realized the truth was more disturbing than a single violent man harming his sister. Claire reached outward constantly during those final months. Teachers noticed bruises. Friends heard fearful confessions. Neighbors reported arguments. Police officers visited the house multiple times. Daniel received desperate emails and 11 unanswered calls the night she vanished. Each person carried one fragment of the truth separately, while convincing themselves it was somebody else's responsibility to act decisively. Ethan spent years tracking those people quietly, recording interviews, gathering forgotten footage, preserving evidence not to prove who murdered Claire, but to expose how ordinary people protect themselves from guilt by doing nothing at all. Daniel asked the question everyone watching this story had been asking for hours. Why now? Ethan stared toward the projector screen where the frozen image of young Daniel abandoning the parking lot still glowed faintly across the wall. Because people only care when they're forced to see themselves in the story, he answered softly. That sentence explained why the videos spread so powerfully across the internet. Ethan understood something terrifying about human nature. Audiences become obsessed with monsters because monsters feel separate from themselves. But Daniel Harper was not a monster. He was ordinary, which meant millions of viewers watching the case unfold recognized pieces of their own past inside him. Moments where they ignored warning signs, avoided confrontation, stayed silent because speaking up felt uncomfortable or inconvenient. Ethan never wanted revenge alone. He wanted reflection. He wanted people forced to confront how many tragedies survive because decent individuals choose emotional safety over difficult action. Then Ethan said the line that would later echo across documentaries, interviews, and headlines nationwide after authorities finally uncovered the truth behind the anonymous uploads. He looked directly at Daniel Harper and spoke with calm exhaustion rather than anger. Nobody killed Claire alone. Silence filled the room afterwards so completely that even the projector's mechanical clicking sounded deafening. Because both men understood what those words truly meant. Richard Bennett may have been the source of Claire's fear, but her suffering survived inside a chain of ignored warnings stretching across an entire community. Teachers, neighbors, police officers, friends, Daniel Harper. Each person stepped slightly aside, hoping somebody else would carry the burden of intervention instead. And Claire Monroe disappeared in the empty space left behind by all that hesitation. 3 days after Daniel Harper met Ethan Monroe inside the abandoned house, Daniel uploaded a video to the internet using his own name. By then, national media outlets were already calling the case one of the most emotionally divisive stories in recent memory. Millions of people had chosen sides. Some believed Daniel deserved to lose everything. Others insisted he was being punished for a tragedy caused by failures far beyond his control. But when the video appeared online, viewers expecting excuses or legal defenses saw something entirely different. Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table, wearing the same exhausted expression that had slowly consumed him throughout the investigation. No lawyers stood beside him. No carefully written statement rested in front of him. For several seconds, he simply stared at the camera silently before finally speaking words many people never expected to hear from him. "I need to stop pretending I didn't know something was wrong," he said quietly. "I saw fear in Claire Monroe long before she disappeared. I saw things that should have forced me to act. And I convinced myself staying silent was safer than being wrong." His voice cracked briefly before he continued. "I didn't hurt Claire, but I failed her, and I've spent 17 years hiding from that truth." The response shocked nearly everyone following the case. Daniel Harper did not confess to murder because there was no evidence he committed one. He did not admit to participating in Claire's disappearance. Instead, he confessed to something millions of viewers found strangely more disturbing because it felt painfully familiar. He admitted to doing nothing. The internet reacted instantly. Some people still condemned him angrily, arguing his silence made him complicit in everything that happened afterward. But something unexpected also began happening beneath the video. Thousands of strangers started sharing stories of their own. Teachers admitting they once ignored signs of abuse because they feared overstepping boundaries. Former students describing classmates they suspected were suffering at home but never checked on directly. Neighbors recalling violent arguments they heard through apartment walls before deciding it was none of their business. One comment received over 200,000 likes after a woman wrote, "I spent years blaming one man for my sister's death before realizing 5 different people had chances to help her and stayed quiet instead." The conversation stopped being only about Daniel Harper or Claire Monroe. It became about something much larger and far more uncomfortable. People started recognizing how often tragedy survives through collective hesitation rather than isolated evil alone. Television networks replayed Daniel's confession repeatedly over the following week while psychologists, journalists, and legal analysts debated the moral questions surrounding the case. Some experts described the phenomenon as diffusion of responsibility, the tendency for individuals to avoid intervention when others are also aware of danger. But for ordinary viewers, the story felt less clinical and more personal. Parents started having difficult conversations with their children about speaking up when something feels wrong. Survivors of abuse flooded online forums describing moments where adults ignored obvious warning signs during their childhood. Former police officers admitted publicly that procedural caution sometimes becomes an excuse for avoiding emotionally difficult situations. The phrase, "nobody killed Claire alone," spread across social media faster than anyone anticipated because it forced people to confront a terrifying possibility about human behavior. Most catastrophic outcomes are not created solely by violent individuals. They grow quietly through communities filled with ordinary people hoping someone else will step forward first. Then Ethan Monroe revealed the final truth nobody outside the original investigation had ever known. During a follow-up interview released anonymously through Rachel Vance's podcast, Ethan explained that Claire Monroe did not die the night she disappeared. In fact, authorities found her alive nearly 3 days later hiding inside an abandoned roadside motel nearly 40 miles outside Westfield. The detail had remained sealed from public records because Claire was still a minor at the time, and investigators believed protecting her privacy mattered more than media attention. According to Ethan, detectives and social workers spent hours trying to convince Claire to identify Richard Bennett formally, so charges could finally be filed. But Claire refused repeatedly. She would not testify. She would not explain exactly what happened. She barely spoke at all. At first, investigators assumed trauma made her afraid. But years later, Ethan learned the real reason from notes buried inside old case files. Claire believed nothing would change, even if she told the truth. Too many adults already knew pieces of what was happening before she disappeared, and none of them protected her. By the time authorities finally found her alive, she had already lost faith in people completely. Ethan revealed one sentence Claire reportedly whispered to a social worker during those final interviews before she was transferred into temporary protective custody. The words devastated everyone who heard them because they transformed the entire story from tragedy into something even more haunting. Nobody was going to help anyway. Daniel Harper listened to that recording alone after it aired publicly and reportedly broke down so violently Rebecca considered calling emergency services. Because at that moment he finally understood the full weight of his silence. Claire had reached outward over and over again during those final months, searching desperately for proof that adults could still be trusted when fear became unbearable. Every unanswered email, every ignored warning sign, every moment of hesitation slowly convinced her nobody would truly protect her no matter how loudly she asked. Richard Bennett may have frightened her, but hopelessness is what ultimately destroyed her belief in survival itself. and hopelessness spread through every person who noticed her suffering while waiting for somebody else to act first. Weeks later, Daniel agreed to participate in one final interview before disappearing completely from public life. The footage remains difficult to watch because by then he no longer looked like the same man from the family photograph shown earlier in the story. His exhaustion felt permanent. The weight of guilt sat visibly across his face even during moments of silence. Near the end of the interview, the reporter asked Daniel whether he considered himself a bad person. Daniel thought quietly for several seconds before answering in a way that unsettled audiences across the country. "I think most people who fail others believe they're good people while they're doing it," he said softly. "That's probably the scariest part." Then he looked directly into the camera with eyes carrying 17 years of regret and spoke the final words that turned this case into something viewers continued discussing long after the story ended. Maybe evil isn't just what people do. Maybe it's what everyone else allows. Silence followed. Daniel stared forward without moving while the camera remained fixed on his face. Then one final question appeared quietly over the screen. "If you were there that night, would you have done anything differently?" Fade to black. Stories like this stay with people because they force us into uncomfortable places we usually avoid. It would be easier if Daniel Harper had been a monster. Easier if Claire Monroe's suffering could be blamed entirely on one violent man and nothing more. But the reason millions of people became obsessed with this case is because it exposed something far more unsettling about human nature. Most people do not see themselves as cruel. Most people believe they would step forward when it truly mattered. Yet history, communities, families, and lives are filled with moments where silence quietly wins instead. Daniel spent 17 years convincing himself hesitation was understandable, that uncertainty excused inaction, that somebody else would eventually carry the responsibility he avoided. And by the time he finally accepted the truth, the damage had already followed him for half a lifetime. Claire Monroe's story stopped being just another disappearance the moment people began recognizing parts of themselves inside everyone who failed her. Maybe that is why the ending feels so heavy long after the story finishes. Because somewhere, someone watching this video has probably ignored warning signs before. Someone has likely heard fear in another person's voice and convinced themselves it was not their place to interfere. Someone chose comfort over confrontation because stepping in felt risky, awkward, or emotionally exhausting. That does not make every silent person evil. But stories like this ask a difficult question many people spend years avoiding. At what point does doing nothing become its own kind of responsibility? Daniel Harper was never arrested for harming Claire Monroe. Legally, many people still argue he committed no crime at all. Yet emotionally, morally, psychologically, he carried consequences powerful enough to destroy almost every part of his life. And maybe that is why audiences continue debating his story long after the cameras stopped recording. So now the question shifts to you. Do you think Daniel deserved what happened to him? Or was he being punished for something most people are guilty of at some point in their lives? And be honest with yourself while answering, because honesty is what makes stories like this uncomfortable in the first place. Have you ever regretted staying silent when somebody needed help? Have you ever sensed something was wrong and convinced yourself it was safer not to get involved? Where does responsibility really begin? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because conversations like these matter more than most people realize. And if this story disturbed you, the next one is even harder to forget. So make sure you subscribe Unseen Mind Labs and turn on notifications, because the next case will challenge everything you think you know about trust, truth, and the choices ordinary people make when fear enters the room.